Hey, I'm Victoria. I'm the director of marketing here at dotCMS, and I'm joined by Preston he's an author, a thought leader in the CMS space, as well as the VP of product at dotCMS. So we're going to dive right into the conversation today because there's been a lot of buzz and a lot of conversations happening on LinkedIn, at in-person events, and in communities across the industry around the end of the pure headless era. So let's dive in there. Several years ago, we saw the beginning of the headless CMS era, where we saw headless CMSs solving important pain points for developers. So what happened and why is this era of pure headless over?
Hello, and thanks, Vic. It's nice to see you, and also thanks for having me. I will say that this really starts from a long time ago, from a bit of ancient history in the archaeology of the CMS. If you think about the CMS as a software product, the CMS content management system vertical has always been a really interesting and unique niche in the world of software. What I mean by that is that the CMS served very uniquely as a nexus of collaboration between very different personas and organizations with very different needs. If you look at the CMS as it first emerged from the detritus of WYSIWYG website builders or some of the glorified blogging tools or forum builders that existed in the late 1990s, one of the most important aspects of the CMS was to enable content editors and marketing teams to be able to pursue some of the most important features and deliverables around content that they wanted to see without needing to rely on a developer. And it's one of the reasons why we saw tools like FrontPage and Dreamweaver emerge. One of the things that's really interesting about the CMS is that this was never really an agreed upon consensus back in that day around the static website. But regardless of that, the static CMS era was really characterized by developers and also content editors rallying around a centralized system for managing content, for developing on content, and also for visually managing and previewing content, alongside all the other things that are important to content management nerds like myself around content governance, content observability, and compliance. So with the headless generation, and we really saw that begin to emerge in the mid 2010s, I would say, the headless CMS really broke that social contract, so to speak. And I wrote about this in CMS Wire about 4 years ago. One of the really challenging things about the headless CMS is obviously developers were chafing at the fact that a lot of the developer experiences of that first generation of static website CMSs were becoming very antiquated and obsolete. We were seeing a lot of resistance to a lot of those server-side technologies. If you think about Drupal's PHP template, for example, a lot of those techniques and a lot of those approaches were really meant for a server-side era that didn't have to deal with a lot of application-level interactivity or client-side dynamism, as we saw emerge with a lot of the experiences that people wanted to build from a developer standpoint, beginning in the mid-2010s and also early 2010s. So the headless CMS emerged as a response in some ways by developers to this, what they saw as a sort of backhanded approach of the earlier CMS generation to make sure and enforce that developers were staying on these antiquated and ancient paradigms. What they didn't realize, however, was the initial headless CMS generation forgot to recognize that the social contract between developers and content editors and marketing teams was actually sacrosanct. And what ended up happening is that a lot of these initial headless CMSs gave too much power over to the developers. And we saw a pendulum swing where developers were able to continue to work on their own applications, but a lot of the marketer-focused or content editor-focused approaches were seen as either discardable or things that were simply not important. And we're now seeing that revolt against that betrayal by developers and architects. I hesitate to use the word betrayal, but it is, I would say, a betrayal of some degree, where marketing teams and content teams are now seeing that preview and other key functionality is now absent from the CMSs they use. So the reason why pure headless CMS is over, in my opinion, is that what we're seeing now is we're seeing a whole new generation of positioning from headless CMSs. A lot of these pure headless CMSs that were formerly for developers, by developers, and also really swung the pendulum in favor of developers are now recognizing, thanks to investor pressure and also customer pressure, that what they're offering is simply not enough. And that's why we're seeing a lot of folks like React Bricks, for example, other CMS companies begin to scramble towards visual building and also visual preview features that re-enable and re-empower and re-democratize the CMS for that marketing and content editor persona.
Right. So where are we headed then? So obviously there's issues that we all are aware of with the headless solutions. But what is the next generation solution? Where are we going?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Vic. And I think that there's a lot of answers that a lot of folks have shared around the really issue at hand, which is how do we restore to some degree an equilibrium that makes sense? First of all, there's two very interesting centrifugal forces that are occurring right now in the CMS market. The first is that marketing organizations are increasingly feeling pressure, especially in the enterprise segment, from what I call the channel explosion. And this is really the proliferation of channels that are really new when it comes to presentation layers. We're talking about extended reality or mobile devices and native mobile apps on iOS and Android. We're talking about voice interfaces and now, of course, AI-driven chatbots and digital signage, in-store displays. The list goes on. The static website obviously is no longer enough and hasn't been enough for quite some time now. But on the other side, we see developer pressure as well. One of the things that a lot of CMSs made the assumption of, and this is true both of the hybrid headless and headless segments of the market, a lot of CMSs made the mistake of saying, well, let's tie our wagon to, let's say, the React ecosystem or to the Vue.js ecosystem without recognizing that oftentimes developers will choose willy-nilly a different ecosystem or a different developer approach depending on their needs and requirements. Someone might use React for one project and then switch over to Vue.js for a different project. And these are two very, very different frameworks from the developer experience standpoint. So the JavaScript renaissance and the growth in the number of frameworks and, of course, continued innovation happening in the framework ecosystems means that we really can't be tying our wagon or putting all of our ducks into or all of our chicks rather, or all of our eggs rather, into a single, mixing my metaphors here, into a single basket when it comes to JavaScript, because it's simply not something that especially large development agencies or consultancies are comfortable doing. So we're seeing these two pressures, and at the same time, we're also seeing an organizational or a personal amount of pressure coming from cross-functional needs. And I'll have to tip my hat, obviously, to folks that have written about this in great detail. Something that Dean Barker calls a race to the middle. I also argue that it's a race to the apex when it comes to the hierarchies of needs pyramids that we see from different personas. We've also heard a lot of folks talk about pendulum swings from various other companies as well. I think one of the most important things we're seeing is this counter reaction to a lot of these pure headless approaches or purely composable approaches comes from the sense of betrayal and the sense of, let's say, disappointment and deception coming from the extinction or the extirpation of some of these key features that marketing organizations and content teams have long held dear. Visual preview, visual content editing, visual building of digital experiences that are not only ready for different JavaScript frameworks, for Next.js, for Astro, for SvelteKit, for Vue.js, for Nuxt.js, for Gatsby.js, but also for the slew of new channels that marketing organizations increasingly see coming down the pike and are part of their strategic roadmaps, and they have no answer for. These pageless or off-the-web experiences like immersive or spatial content and spoken content as well. That's why I believe that Universal CMS is the future, because just like the original, let's say, legacy static CMS was really optimized for the static website, that's really all it was. It was really optimized for that server-side static website. But what the Universal CMS is really pointed towards as a paradigm is treating everything possible as a first-class citizen, treating not just a static website as a first-class citizen, but also Next.js, Vue.js, Angular, what have you, and also the channels that marketing organizations are increasingly pressured to implement for, such as immersive, extended reality, chatbots, voice interfaces, and so on and so forth. So the Universal CMS is really about not only treating new JavaScript frameworks and new developer approaches as first-class citizens, not only treating new delivery channels and marketing needs as first-class citizens, but also returning and restoring the equilibrium that characterized that first CMS generation by saying, hey, it's not just these things that are first-class citizens, it's the people behind content management systems, the marketers, the content editors, the compliance officers, the accessibility reviewers and specialists, and also the developers working on all of these things need to be aligned and able to work in a very independent way while also still being empowered to do their best work. Because at the end of the day, content is really just about people.
Fair enough. So it really sounds like the Universal CMS is the best of both worlds for everyone from a persona perspective, from a technology perspective. How would you differentiate the Universal CMS concept from what we've heard in the past around hybrid headless or hybrid CMS?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Vic. And I think this really points to some of the very interesting trends we're seeing around how history is somewhat repeating itself. One of the things that I've noticed is, about, let's say 6 or 7 years ago, one of the things that we heard from a lot of headless CMSs, pure headless CMSs, is the notion of, well, hey, a lot of these quote unquote hybrid headless CMSs are just monolithic CMSs or so-called legacy CMSs with APIs or application programming interfaces to consume data bolted on. So just, the same old hat, the same old tired CMS with APIs bolted on. But we're seeing the same thing happen in the headless market right now as well, where we're hearing people say, well, we're a pure headless CMS with visual editing bolted on or visual building bolted on, which is very ironic given what's been going on. But to answer the question very directly and very succinctly, the key difference here is that we're seeing convergent evolution between hybrid headless CMSs and headless CMSs. But the fact of the matter is, because of the initial orientation and because of the very sort of perspective from which these two products or product categories are approaching customer needs from, we're seeing bias towards developers or bias towards content teams. Whereas what I believe we need is a democratization of the CMS for both personas and all personas involved in the CMS, because the hybrid headless CMS is fantastic for content editors, fantastic for marketers, but developers are still not a big fan of some of the tools that they have to work with and some of the ecosystems they have to work with from a developer experience standpoint. Part of that is because of the APIs. Part of that is because of overly opinionated software development kits or SDKs that are part of these developer ecosystems that these hybrid headless CMSs have built. And part of it is also simply just the fact that hybrid headless CMSs potentially use, some of them at least, antiquated approaches to retrieving and serving data.
So why Universal specifically? What makes Universal not just another industry buzzwords? Because we know that the industry is flooded with them.
Absolutely. And I was just having a conversation with one of our dear colleagues, John Michael Thomas, on this very topic of buzzwords and why they're so dangerous. I think with buzzwords, my personal opinion is that I very rarely like to assign any sort of a term to something unless I've already seen a clear trend. And we're seeing clearly through messaging from folks like Dean Barker, from messaging around folks like Sitecore or Contento or Oracle, that or Crown Peak even, that Universal CMS has touched a nerve and has struck a chord. And what I mean by that is there's one key metaphor and one key analogy I want to make here. But before I get there, there's a whole idea of Universal being the best of all worlds for everybody. That sort of universal hub or universal center, nerve center for everybody who wants to be able to interact with the CMS in rich ways across a slew of different channels and also presentation layers. But I think if we take a look back at the advent of what is now known as Universal JavaScript, and this is going to be a little bit more for the developers in the room, but Universal JavaScript was a very key event or a very key focus of what's now called the JavaScript Renaissance, when JavaScript became a language that wasn't just something that you could use on the client side, limited to poking at client-side interactions using AJAX or DHTML techniques. It wasn't just about using jQuery to, let's say, manipulate very small elements of the page or, less performantly, large elements on the page. But it was really about empowering developers to build applications in the way that they wanted to, and in a maintainable and manageable way. The revolutionary thing that Universal JavaScript enabled by providing JavaScript across both the server side and the client side is that you could share code across both the server and client. And this is really analogous to the Universal CMS because what we saw was at the time, it violated a whole bunch of architectural or agreed upon separations of concerns, for example, between client and server, or for example, between designers and developers at that time, web designers and web developers, to be clear. And a lot of people really recoiled and revolted against this sort of idea. But what was actually the case here, as we saw a few years later, as universal JavaScript proliferated across the JavaScript landscape, is that what developers actually wanted was a component level separation of concerns that allowed for them to manipulate and manage components in a more maintainable way by sharing code, straddling this separation of concerns across web developers and web designers, and also across HTML and server-side code, and also across server and client, which is, of course, the key architectural separation of concerns here. So Universal CMS is interesting because the headless CMS, the pure headless CMS, came in and said, the separation of concerns that we need for really good CMS architectures that are future-proof is between data and its presentation, or data as housed in a database or shown as objects in an API, and presentation as in the visual presentation or interactive presentation of that data. But what they also did is they enforced a persona level or organizational or functional separation of concerns between those who are managing the content and those who are presenting the content. And in this case, they really relegated those content editors and marketing teams that had been able to exert control and influence over the presentation of their content to solely being glorified data entry analysts. And what this did is it forced a lot of increased friction on developers, because now developers had to re-enable a lot of these lost workflows, and it made it very difficult for developers and content teams alike to progress with their roadmaps and their innovation. And what we see here is that the reason why Universal CMS is now emerging and is a paradigm that many people are talking about is because of the same reason of convenience. Yes, there is this pre-existing separation of concerns that makes a lot of sense, certainly from an architectural perspective, but from a cross-functional and organizational and a persona level perspective, it doesn't make sense. And we're seeing now the same sort of component level or visual level, let's say presentation level separation of concerns, where just as JavaScript developers back in that era of universal JavaScript in the late 2010s wanted to be able to manage components across both client and server maintainably, it's the same thing that marketing teams and content teams want, is to manage layout components, manage their content in these block level components in ways that straddle both the content and developer experiences.
Cool. And so on that topic around your content teams and your developers, what features do they need in a CMS, in a universal CMS? Or rather, what features does a CMS need in order to be universal and move forward?
It's a fantastic question, Vic. And I'll start by saying that every single CMS today, I don't want to by any means belittle any of the CMS players in the market, because today, right now, right, every single CMS in the market has some degree of what's necessary for the universal CMS to be a paradigm. And I do want to emphasize here as well that I see this as an industry-wide trend. It's not something that I see as solely limited to a particular segment or a single vendor. It's just the trend that we've identified and that we're seeing in the market. Hybrid headless CMSs have some of these capabilities, right? The features that we're talking about are visual editing, layout management, templated content management in terms of layout management as well, drag and drop layout building, some degree of the coupling that we see in some of these historic CMSs or legacy CMSs around seeing that content and their changes occur within the context of that presentation layer. We're also seeing, for example, a lot of hybrid headless CMSs sort of regain primacy to some degree, namely things like editorial workflows, preview workflows, approval workflows, compliance workflows, scheduling content. And these are all things that, some headless CMSs have, but not all. From the headless CMS standpoint, however, there's really great things the headless CMS segment of the market is doing that any universal CMS needs to have to support a universal CMS. And that is, of course, a very rich and a very powerful API ecosystem with great surface area for every content need. We also need an SDK ecosystem that is really unopinionated, but also very powerful for developers to use that content data flexibly, and also potentially the presentational data or layout as a service data or navigation as a service data flexibly as well. And we also just in general need an integration ecosystem, or let's say a SDK ecosystem that honors core developer needs like a command line interface, but also things like, okay, agnosticism across React, Next.js, Vue.js, Gatsby, Gridsome, Astro, Svelte, Angular, even some of the frameworks that are still in use that people don't hear as much about, like Ember, for example. These are all things that Universal CMSs need to enable. So from both a developer standpoint with headless CMSs and also a content and marketing standpoint with hybrid headless CMSs, all the pieces are there, but the Universal CMS will have all of them for all channels and all technologies.
Got it. So what is next for the industry and what is next for CMS vendors? Where do we go from here? Because obviously we've identified the challenges amongst every persona. We know what the problems are. What's next?
Absolutely. I think that the industry is headed in a direction that is really interesting, in my opinion. I think that this is a very exciting time to be in the CMS industry and market, because we're seeing a very interesting degree of centralization, or I would say convergent evolution between different market segments. We're seeing obviously hybrid headless players really work on developer experience that is completely untethered to their existing developer experiences, monolithically speaking. We're also seeing a lot of headless CMSs and composable CMSs begin to adopt features that would have been anathema to their original founders or their original product folks, in terms of enabling marketing and content organizations to work flexibly across the CMS. And what I see is actually just the convergent evolution continuing to the point where, as Mark Ursino of the Sitecore ecosystem shared recently, is going to lead to there really not being a headless CMS or a hybrid headless CMS or any distinction between the two, but a new CMS generation that will be the Universal CMS, but that we can simply call the CMS. And I probably shouldn't say this right now, but I do think that, with this convergent evolution, we'll eventually obviate the need for even a term to differentiate a Universal CMS, because that will be the assumed nature and architecture of the CMS that doesn't carry the baggage of, let's say, the static website era.
Awesome. This has been a very interesting conversation, and there's a lot to look forward to. So definitely more to come.
Absolutely. And if I may, I'll just say thank you to Vic and also for the great questions and the great conversation and discussion.
Awesome.